Okay, thanks for inviting me to your party. So we all know the future is bright for robots, but what about work? What is the future bright also for employment, for labor, for opportunity? And so that's the question I want to talk about today, and specifically I want to ask the question, why are there still so many jobs? So if you think about it, or let's start with a concrete example. You might have heard of the automated teller machine, those vending machines that dispense cash. When they were introduced in 1960, people imagined that that would spell the end of the teller job. But in fact, between 1990 and 2010, the number of bank tellers working in the United States approximately doubled, from about 250,000 to 500,000. This is in work reported by James Besson, who's an economist at Boston University. And so that raises an interesting question. What are all those tellers doing, and why hasn't automation already replaced them? But in fact, if you think about it, many of the great inventions of the last 200 years were specifically designed to displace labor. So the tractor eliminated the need for animal power and human muscle power in a lot of agriculture. The assembly line was designed to eliminate repetitive, artisanal craft work and replace it with machine precision. The computer was designed to replace cumbersome, error-prone human calculation with digital precision. And these inventions have worked. We no longer dig ditches by hand. We don't pound tools out of wrought iron. We don't do bookkeeping using books. And yet, despite that incredible success in eliminating labor from many of the most labor-intensive activities in the economy, the number of people, the fraction of adults employed in the formal labor force, has risen for most of the last 130 years. Only in 2 decades of the last 130 years has it declined at all. A lot of that rise, by the way, reflects the movement of women out of unpaid, grueling, and restrictive labor in the home into a better set of opportunities in the marketplace. So these facts raise the question, why hasn't automation already eliminated work? Why hasn't it made us redundant, our skills unnecessary, our labor obsolete? I'm going to give you a 2-part answer to that question. One part has to do with human creativity and judgment and expertise. I'm going to call this the Oring principle. A second has to do with human insatiability, or greed if you like. I'm going to call this the never get enough principle. And these two things are going to sketch a bit of an economic answer of why employment continues to grow despite vast increases in productivity that would make our labor unnecessary if we continue to do only exactly what we had done before. And then I'm going to make the point that doesn't mean there's nothing to be concerned about. There's plenty to be concerned about in this space, but it's not having to do with a lack of jobs. It has much more to do with opportunity and skills and adaptation to change. So let me start off with the O-ring principle, and let's return to those bank tellers. So this figure shows you the growth of bank tellers in green and automated teller machines in red, and the surprising thing is they move largely in parallel upward in this period. But just as you would expect, when those ATMs were introduced, they did in fact dramatically displace a lot of the cash handling routine transactions that tellers did. And the number of tellers per branch fell by about 1/3. So just as you would expect, ATMs displaced bank tellers. But banks pretty soon realized, hey, now that we can open a branch with a machine and a couple of tellers, we can branch much more aggressively. We can open more storefronts. And the net effect was actually to increase the number of bank tellers. But that's too simple. Because it wasn't just a numerical change in the number of tellers, but it was also a change in what they did. As automation replaced a lot of their kind of checkout tasks, their cash handling tasks, they became much more customer service agents, solving problems, forging relationships with customers, and introducing them to new services like bank accounts, credit cards, investments. As we now know, some of those things they didn't need, didn't even realize they were getting, but that was the job. This example actually highlights a fairly fundamental point in economics and automation, that most jobs encompass a panoply of tasks, a set of things that all need to be accomplished. And some of those are perspiration, some are inspiration, some take expertise, some are rote repetition, but in general, they all need to be done. If that's true, if all those tasks need to be accomplished, then automating a subset of them actually raises the value of people's labor in the remaining set. So as people, as they stop needing to do checkout jobs, the value of their expertise, their judgment, their creativity in dealing with customers became more important, more indispensable. And so this notion, this complementarity as economists call it, is a very fundamental property of many forms of work. So now let me give you an extremely stark example of this. So in 1986, the US Space Shuttle Challenger took off from Cape Canaveral. One of its booster rockets exploded within a few seconds of liftoff, and within 90 seconds, the mission had failed catastrophically, leading to the death of 6 astronauts. There's a famous, believe it or not, economics paper written about this topic. There are also actually many famous engineering papers. In fact, the economist who wrote the paper, it's called the Oring theory of production, is Michael Kramer, who you may know won the Nobel Prize in economics yesterday in conjunction with my colleagues Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee. And he makes the following point. He says, imagine performing a job as a series of interconnected tasks, links in a chain. And each one of these links needs to remain fast for the job for the task to be concluded. Should one of those links fail, the entire mission will fail. So take, for example, the Challenger. After a brief investigation, it was realized that the entire cause of this failure of this multi-billion-dollar, multi-year enterprise was a simple rubber O-ring in one of the booster rockets that had frozen on the launch pad the night before and failed catastrophically immediately upon liftoff by letting gases out of the chamber. Similarly, and so that is why the paper is called the O-ring model, because one tiny link in the chain of production was sufficient to cause the entire mission to fail. Well, this is a rather terrifying notion of work, but it actually has a surprisingly positive implication, which is, imagine you're part of a team, and all the team and everyone on the team is kind of a weak link. And so the question is, well, what is your value added in that setting? And the answer is going to be, well, not very much, because even if you do your job really well and your link holds, some other link is surely going to break, and so it won't really matter. Now, as we improve the quality, the robustness, the reliability of each of the links in the chain, ultimately, each remaining link becomes more essential. In the limit, the only thing that matters is the success of your or failure of your link, because all the other ones have been made reliable. Similarly, with the Challenger, the reason that O-ring was so critical is because everything else worked. Had this been an unreliable piece of engineering, that wouldn't have been essential. If the O-ring hadn't failed, something else would. In much of the work that we now do, we play O-ring roles. That is, a lot of the success or failure of production depends on our expertise, on our judgment, on our creativity. So as technology improves the set of tools we use, the options and capacities that we have, our ability to make good decisions becomes more and more important. That was true for the bank tellers as they moved from cash handling into customer service. The set of skills required improved, the value added that they had potential to make improved. But it's also true whether you're teaching a class, whether you're designing a building, whether you're treating a patient. As technology improves the scope, the quality, the potential for what we can do, the value of our own contribution, but our expertise by meaning having some body of knowledge, our judgment, which means knowing when to take an element from that body of knowledge and apply it to a specific problem, and our creativity, meaning taking that knowledge and applying it to a new domain, those things become more important. The leverage of those things increases. So that is the O-ring principle that describes the type of work we do as technology improves. but it doesn't tell you much about how much work there is to do. And here I'm going to turn to a second principle, which I'm going to call never get enough. So you might think that as we get more and more productive at stuff, there'll just be less of that thing to do. Take, for example, agriculture. In 1900, 40% of all US employment was on farms. Today, it's under 2% and falling. That's a huge amount of productivity growth, but it also means there are only so many Oring jobs left in farming, right? We're in a situation now where a couple million farmers can feed a population of more than 300 million and export a ton or many, many tons of food. That's incredible. What happened there? Well, it's not that we're eating less. Clearly, we became sufficiently productive that we needed fewer people to do farming. And agriculture is not an isolated example. You can give examples like this in steel production, in light bulb production. Many, many things, eventually, as we become better and better at it, eventually we're out of a job. There isn't more of that to do, or at least enough of that to do to keep employment, maintain employment. But what is true for an individual sector or service has never been true for the economy as a whole. As our technology improves and our wealth rises, we invent new services, new activities, new products that command attention, that drive consumption, and that use skills and labor. So many of the industries in which people work now, health services, finance, engineering, and computation, were tiny or barely existed 100 years ago. Many of the things that people spend their money on, like SUVs or air conditioners or mobile devices, hadn't been invented a century ago. Now, you can say, well, many of these things are frivolous. Who needs them? Who needs Pokemon Go? Who needs, search engine optimizers? Who needs botnet harvesters and so on? That's fine. But people seem to value those things, and they seem to be willing to work hard to get them. The average worker in 2015 could have the average standard of living of a worker in 1915 by working just 18 weeks a year. Right? Less than half the year. Most people choose not to do that. They want the things that are available from hard work because the set of options that are accessible now are so attractive. Right? And this has always been true. Alfred Marshall, famous economist in the Victorian era, noticed that people are insatiable. And Thorstein Veblen said, invention is the mother of necessity. The more things we invent, the more things we need. So let me try to make that concrete in terms of this process of how does new work emerge? So I'm going to classify these into 4 different categories of how this never get enough principle operates. I'm going to call them Uber effects, Walmart effects, network effects, and the pure invention of new work. So let's start with the Uber effect. Uber found a better, cheaper way to deliver ride-hailing services to customers. Just in the 3 years between 2015 and 2018, the number of taxi trips in Manhattan fell by 25%. So clearly, Uber had the effect of displacing work in that arena. But of course, the number of ride-hailing trips almost doubled in that same period. And that meant a lot more people working in transportation services, right? So one way you can get employment out of productivity growth is simply, if you improve something enough, you may get so much more demand that you get more people working in it, not less. So the efficiency of transportation has increased, but the number of people in it has risen. A second possibility is that as prices fall, people spend money elsewhere, right? So if you reduce the price of one thing, you free income for consumption in another. So over the course of a century, the share of household income spent on necessities, by which I mean food, clothing, and housing, fell from 85% to 55% of all expenditure. And that's just between 1901 and 2002. That's for the average household. So that means 30% of expenditure of income was now available for other purposes. Now, it could have been that people saved it, but this is America. So they didn't. They spent it on other stuff, right? So we know as people got wealthier, less of their total income was spent on food, clothing, and housing. The rest of it must have been spent on entertainment and eating out and electronics and larger televisions and so on, right? Or on prep for their college prep for their kids, if you happen to be of that age. So that's a second effect. You free income, people spend it elsewhere. A third is what I'm going to call network effects. Let's take the example of steel. So there's been tons of progress in the production of steel, if you'll forgive me. So the number of hours required to produce a ton of steel fell by 85% over the course of 35 years. So you might think, that's going to displace a lot of steel workers, and that is absolutely correct. There are about 400,000 steel workers in the United States. There used to be more than double that. And it's not because steel output has risen, it's because we are so much more efficient at making steel, you just don't need as many people to do it, even if all of our steel were produced domestically. However, there are more than 4 million people employed in so-called metal-using industries, right? So in fabricated metal, in machinery, in motor vehicles and aircrafts. And as the price of steel falls, right, as productivity rises, the price falls, that makes these other sectors able to produce more with less, right? They make cheaper cars, better aircraft, and so on. And because there's a lot of employment there and demand for those goods is elastic, a productivity increase in one sector will tend to create employment in the sectors that depend upon that input. Similarly, productivity increases in steel will also create demand for the industries that sell to the steel. So iron and ore extraction, right? Mining, energy production, all those things that are inputs into steel. As steel productivity rises, the number of workers in steel falls, the inputs into steel rise, and the customers that depend upon steel grow. So that also creates employment. So productivity growth is not intrinsically the enemy of employment, even if it shrinks the sector in which it occurs, as in agriculture. But now finally, I want to talk about the invention of new work. So a really interesting feature of the US, so the US Census Bureau, which is one of the world's greatest statistical agencies, has been collecting information on what people do for more than 100 years. And every decade, they produce a catalog of all of the occupational titles that people write in on their census forms. So people say, what do you do? And they produce this list so they can classify people into a broader occupation. So the list in this catalog has between 50 and 30,000 entries, depending on what decade you're looking at. And as these classifiers work, they sometimes come across jobs that they haven't heard of. And when enough people write in a job that they haven't previously heard of, they add it to this classified index. And so you can use successive editions of this classified index to look at the type of work that is being added to the US economy over time. This refers to joint work that I'm doing with Anna Solomons of the University of Utrecht and builds on work by Jeffrey Lynn, who's an economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. So you might think, well, what does new work look like? And so when Anna and I were looking at this, we said, it must be all these kind of frontier jobs, these kind of high-tech George Jetson jobs. You guys have heard of, some of you heard of George Jetson? Whew, okay, all right, here's George Jetson. Here are some of the frontier jobs added to the US Census between 1980 and 2016. They're added decade by decade. So one is supervisor of word processing, circuit layout designer, artificial intelligence specialist. So by the way, the Census Bureau is not slow, right? That was 2000. This got added to the census. That's pretty good. Ethnocardiographer, wind turbine technician, computing services director, right? So there's a lot of new high-tech work being added to the economy, people who make, design, integrate, interpret the new technology and apply it across sectors. However, that's not all of it. If you look at the list of things being added, there's another large category of what Anna and I call wealth work. These are jobs that have no specific technological component, but they become, the demand for them rises as affluence increases and preferences change. So I'm going to talk about some wealth work. So there's George Jetson at home. Does anyone know the name of George Jetson's robotic butler? You guys are so good, I had to look that up. Okay, so here are some of the rosy jobs added by decade. Gift wrapper in 1980, fingernail former in 1990, the ever popular oyster preparer in 2000, horse exerciser, of course, everybody has one, sommelier right, let's be clear. Sommeliers were not invented in 2010, right? They have been in existence since the foundation of the Republic of France. However, enough people started doing this for a living in the United States in that decade that the Census Bureau added it to our classification. And the golf cart mechanic in anticipation of the outcome of the presidential election, I suppose. So this is a second component, right? There's a lot of new work that's created that is not STEM work, and that's really important to know, right? Not all new jobs are people with CS degrees or technical degrees. A lot of them are services. Some of them are creative, and some of them are just require a lot of labor. Interestingly, there's another category, what we call last mile jobs. These are jobs that used to be a more robust set of activities that are slowly being automated away. Last mile job in the Jetsons, the winder of the robotic football player, right? I guess the robot could play football, but not until you wound the spring. So here are some added to the census. In 1980, the tamale machine feeder, the vending machine attendant, the chat room host monitor, the underground utility cable locator, and the teleprompter. So these are jobs that in some sense are being automated away, but in the meantime, there's a lot of them. So for example, a really good example of this would be the Amazon warehouse picker, right? The person at the front of the Amazon warehouse where the robotic drive unit brings the shelf, the laser pointer points at the object, the person who grabs the objects, puts it in a box. That is a really rapid growth category. There are more than 500,000 people who do that in the United States. It will be a rapid contraction category over the next 10 or 15 years for sure. Okay, so there's lots of new work. It's not simply getting better at the same things. As technology advances the set of possibilities, we create new activities, some of which have to do directly with servicing, interpreting, deploying the technology, creating the technology, and some of which just reflect rising incomes that creates demand for new activities and services. So then, is there nothing to worry about? I've told you that we're not going to run out of jobs. If you wanted further evidence on that, the US has added 22 million jobs since the nadir of the Great Recession, and that's a massive increase to the total size of the US labor force, and it is the case that our employment to population rates are now higher than they were 20 years ago across many groups, including people who have physical work limitations, people who have criminal histories, and so on. We are creating more work than the typical employees could supply, and therefore more hiring is going on. That's a good thing. However, the problem is not the number of jobs, but the quality and accessibility of those jobs. If you look at the development of employment in the United States and many other advanced economies, it looks a lot like a barbell with increasing poundage on either end of the bar. Right? On the one hand, we have growth of professional, technical, and managerial work, this high-paid, highly educated, specialized work where people do interesting things and have a lot of economic security. We also have a lot of growth in personal services that are low-paid and typically they're low-educated and typically low-paid. Food service, cleaning, security, home health aides, entertainment, recreation, and these activities, because they don't typically require specialized skills, are accessible. Many people can do them, but because they're not specialized, wages don't tend to rise over the life cycle, and people don't have a lot of economic security because they can be readily replaced by someone else who can be trained up for that work in the course of a few weeks or months. Contracting rapidly in the middle are many production, office clerical, sales, support, administrative jobs that carry out well-defined and codified procedures that increasingly can be done by machines instead of by people. So we understand the process, but it creates a challenge because this polarization of the labor market shrinks the size of the middle class, knocks out rungs in the career ladder, and potentially inhibits the possibility of intergenerational mobility of people going from rags to riches over the course of a generation. And you can see that, by the way, in our income data, which is incredibly polarized. Real earnings of the highly educated have grown spectacularly over the last 40 years. Real earnings of people with high school or below have fallen substantially since 1980. So now let me talk about, in the remaining minutes, how do we address this challenge? You might think, well, is there anything we can do about this? Well, let's go back to those farmers. In the late 1900s and early 20th century, families in farm states saw a problem. They said, we're entering a period where our children's labor will no longer be needed on the farm, but it's not clear that they're prepared for industry, that they have the skills needed to make the leap into the next set of activities. What did they do? They passed laws that said their kids needed to stay in high school until they were 16. I would like to pass that law for my children for college as well. And this was an incredibly expensive thing to do. Not only did they have to hire teachers, build buildings, buy books, but it meant that their children couldn't work on the farm in those periods. They would normally be working from age 10 forward or perhaps younger. They couldn't. This was thought by the rest of the world to be a frivolous idea. Why does everyone need to be both literate and numerate? Aren't you over-educating them? It turned out to be one of the best public investments the United States made in the 20th century. It gave us the most skilled, the most productive, the most flexible labor force. Arguably part of the reason the US was able to extremely rapidly mount a successful effort in the Second World War to industrialize and build a war machine was because it had such a skilled workforce. And that has been the history, that has been a key to our success. And if you look at present, we are again in a period of very rapidly rising educational attainment. And that's a good thing. Just in the last 10 years, the share of young people graduating high school has risen by several percentage points, and the share of young adults completing college has also risen. So that's something good. So there's reason for optimism, but the challenge is to keep skills apace such that people can access those growing high-wage opportunities, that there will be fewer people available to do those service jobs, and because there will be fewer people available, those jobs will pay better. They will be better jobs because not that many people are accessible to do them. Okay, so let me just wrap up in the last minute. Is this time different? Well, of course, every time is different. However, let me talk about something that will be familiar to all of you, artificial intelligence. A lot of the history of computing is about overcoming what I call Palani's paradox. Michael Palani was a philosopher of science, and he made the observation, we know more than we can tell. There are many things that we do that we don't know how to do. And that's a challenge for automation, because it's hard to program a computer to do something that you don't know how to do. I know how to tell someone to do a series of calculations, to do algebra, et cetera, but I don't know how to tell them to produce a convincing argument, or recognize a child's face in a photograph, or ride a bicycle. So the artificial intelligence solution to this problem, of course, is even if we can't tell a machine explicitly how to do something, we can now develop machines. When we say we, I don't mean me, but many, that can master tasks by emulating successful examples carried out by people. Right? So this potentially overcomes the problem. Machines can do things that neither they know how to do nor we know how to do simply by following worked examples. And you can find many great small triumphs in this domain. So this is, of course, the Google X Lab famously recognizing cat photographs, although I will point out that may not be a cat photograph. But let me point out where this potentially runs into limitations. So this is a well-known paper from computer science called "What Makes a Chair a Chair?" And this is a classic problem. How do you get a machine to recognize objects in a photograph that are a chair? Well, one way you could do is you could write down an explicit set of rules, and you could say, well, look for things that have 4 legs and a base and a back. And if you sent the software out to do that, it would come up with chairs, but it would leave out many of the, would leave out the stools, right? It would leave out the 3-legged chairs, would leave out the recliners. So you could say, just needs to have a seating surface and a leg. And pretty soon it gets everything, plus it also gets the couches, and it also gets the tables, right? So it's too big. And you might say, well, how do people make these distinctions? Well, these authors argue, and I think there's a lot to this argument, that it's more than just recognizing the characteristics of objects. We have in mind a model of the world. So we know what things are for. So when I look at these things, I think, okay, would I want to sit on that? Well, that one looks fine. That, okay, probably not. Okay? Why not? Because I recognize not just what are the ascriptive characteristics of the object, but I reason how it can be used. And that is a much more sophisticated exercise than simply recognizing visual characteristics. Or as Carl Sagan famously said, if you want to bake an apple pie from scratch, you need to first invent the universe. This feels a bit like inventing the universe. Okay, So let me conclude. One thing that has not changed is people's concern about this issue. You can look at the Luddites in 1812 in the UK. US Secretary of Labor James Davis in 1927, who was concerned about the scrapping of men. This is before the Great Depression. Vasily Leontiev in 1982, likening people to horses and saying people will soon be put out to pasture, just as horses did in the 20th century. Or even the MIT Technology Review showing you how machines first make people more productive and eventually make them redundant. I find these predictions far too pessimistic. And I think they reflect a lack of imagination. People are saying, I can't imagine what people will do in the future, and therefore there will be no work to do. That's a pretty bold statement. They're saying, not only can I not think of it, but you won't think of it, and your children won't think of it either. Look, I couldn't tell you at all what people will do for a living 100 years from now, but that's okay. They don't need me to figure it out for them. History suggests they will figure it out for themselves. I like to think back, if I were a farmer in 1900, and 4 out of 10 people of everyone I knew was also a farmer, and some twerpy economist from MIT, teleported back to the past and said to me, hey, guess what, Farmer Autor, I have exciting news for you. Over the next 100 years, the fraction of farmers will fall from 40% of employment to 2% of employment, purely because of rising productivity. What do you think the other 38 out of 40 farmers are going to do for a living? Well, I wouldn't have said, oh, we got this. Telepathic medicine, search engine optimization, right? Celebrity tourism, right? I would have had no idea, of course. However, I hope I would have at least had the common sense to notice that, wow, that's an incredible, it's a 95% reduction in labor needed to do agriculture with no starvation, presumably. That's a huge amount of productivity growth and therefore a huge amount of societal income growth. So I hope people find something useful to do, something good to do with all of that productivity, with all of that bounty, with all those possibilities. And I would say the lesson, at least of the 100 years, is we've managed that pretty well. We've found pretty good things to do with that. And so the opportunity is ours to continue to do that as we move into this next technological future. Okay, thank you very much.